Welcome to the Sanity interview by the New York Sun. My name is A.R. Hoffman, and join my co-host Rebecca Sugar and I every week for a conversation with a newsmaker that you want to hear from.
We're joined today by our guest, Colin Wright. Colin's an evolutionary biologist, a fellow at the Manhattan Institute. He's also an academic advisor for the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine and founding editor of Reality's Last Stand. And you can find his writings really just about everywhere. Long list, and I recommend them to you. Colin, thanks for being here today.
I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for the invite.
Pleasure. I think the best thing to do is just to start with some definitions. You're really good at offering them from a biology perspective. Can you just explain to all of us what is sex and what is gender?
Yeah, the former is a little easier for me as a biologist to define. And there's also several meanings of sex, so I'll try to clarify these things. So when we talk about what sex is, you could be talking about sexual reproduction. So this is just when two genomes recombine by fusing gametes of some sort, either sperm or ova, or sometimes even gametes of the same size that they're not distinguished by sperm or ova. And basically, you're fertilized by two different genomes. They come together and they create like a new organism, a totally genetically unique individual. So that's what sexual reproduction is, as opposed to like certain yeast that might be budding off and making clones of themselves, aphids, that type of thing. They don't have sex. They're asexual creatures. When we talk about what sex is, when we're talking about the sex of a person or the sex of an individual, what we're talking about is these different evolved reproductive strategies that are defined by whether you're an individual with the biological function to produce many small gametes, these are called sperm, or if you have the biological function to produce much fewer but larger gametes, and they also often have more nutrients involved with them, which we call eggs or ova. So that's what, when we're referring to an individual, we're asking what type of reproductive strategy does this individual deploy? In humans and other mammals, we're what are called gonochoric species, meaning that our males and females are in separate bodies, okay? And then when we're born, along development in utero is when we acquire a sex, and we maintain the same sex throughout our entire lives. This is in contrast to things like sequential hermaphrodites, like clownfish, that will start off as male and change to female eventually in their lives, or vice versa, or simultaneous hermaphrodites who are both simultaneously male and female. They're deploying both of those reproductive strategies at one time.
So I apologize. I just wanted to say I feel like we're taking people back to ninth grade biology class, but it's really critical that we do that. We need a biology lesson, and that's why we had you on. And before you move on, I just wanted to ask quickly, so it's not just the function of producing one gamete or the other, it's the potential to produce that gamete, whether or not you do. You are still a male or a female based on even the system that would produce such things, even if those things are not produced.
Yeah, so if we're talking about mammals, as I mentioned, we're gonochoric. We have separate species, separate sexes and separate bodies. When we're talking about what sex an individual is, we're looking at the way their reproductive system is organized around the type of gamete that they would produce. Right. They don't actually have to produce this gamete. Adolescent boys, for instance, aren't producing sperm until they hit puberty. Postmenopausal women, they're no longer having periods or producing ova. So it's fundamentally about the reproductive system that they have in place that has the function to produce a certain type of gamete, whether or not that's actually realized.
Clear. Got it. Okay. And gender. Is gender a biological term? And if not, what is it? What does it mean?
It really always comes down to what people mean when they talk about gender. So as a biologist, we don't really use this term much. Sometimes they will. So my background is in behavioral ecology. And sometimes we talk about gender when we're talking about behavioral differences among the sexes. The males are more aggressive. They're more sexually promiscuous. They're more whatever. There's a distinct difference between the sexes and how they behave. Sometimes we refer to that as gender. But then there's, I think, there's been a proliferation of different definitions of what gender is applied to humans, from like feminist theory and things like that, where they talk about it's like a system of oppression. We have gender roles that society is sort of whipping us into performing based on your sex. We have gender identity, which is, the degree in your head that you think you subscribe to certain masculine and feminine stereotypes or ideals. So there's all kinds of that stuff. So I usually just ask people what they mean by gender, so then I can make sure that it's not conflicting with anything about the biology of sex or anything like that.
Okay, and just a couple more definitions that I think are going to be helpful here. Can you explain what intersex is as opposed to transgender, as opposed to transsexual? These
are also terms that have been kind of politicized a lot. So intersex is actually a very specific term. It specifically applies to certain conditions that individuals might have that results in at least the appearance of sex ambiguity at birth, or a mismatch between one's internal reproductive organs and their kind of outward appearance of their sex. So people with a complete androgen insensitivity syndrome who are biologically male given their internal reproductive system, but they appear on the outside female, that would be an intersex condition. And just any other condition that is actually resulting in an ambiguous phenotype, usually just at the genitals at birth. Then there's a broader category of DSDs, or differences of sexual development. It's important to note that all intersex conditions are DSDs, but not all DSDs are intersex conditions. Intersex is just, again, that small subset of DSDs that actually appear ambiguous. So that's intersex and DSD. What was the other thing you wanted me to define?
Transgender, transsexual, because these are the words that are in play.
We often get people muddling intersex and transgender. There's usually this move to say like sex is a spectrum because we have these conditions that result in ambiguous genitalia. Therefore, we can't really talk about males and females as being these categorical things, these binary categories. And then they use that to then say, well, then we shouldn't really be giving the label male or female to anyone, since these are kind of statistical terms if it's all a spectrum. And then they apply that to people who are trans. But people who are trans don't actually have an intersex condition, I guess, to the degree that they don't. I mean, some possibly do. But being trans is fundamentally it's an identity. It's someone who identifies as the opposite sex. And I usually like to say that someone who takes steps to actually medically transition is what we mean by someone who's transgender, rather than an identity by itself. Although a lot of activists like to think of being trans as this umbrella term for anyone who like identifies with or behaves according to the stereotypes of the opposite sex, that type of thing.
Right. So I started with biology lesson, not just because you're an evolutionary biologist, but because I think a lot of us need a refresher course. And you got into a lot of trouble a few years ago for just doing what you just did. And can you just give the audience a brief history of your badge of honor being canceled for saying much of what you just said?
Yeah, so there were several events, I guess, of canceling. So in 2018 is when I first started writing about this issue. I wrote about it for Quillette, which is sort of a heterodox magazine at the time. It was somewhat small then. It's grown since then. And I just made basically these arguments that, we should treat trans people with respect as individuals, but we shouldn't be jettisoning this whole idea of biological sex, because it's a very important thing for not only just humans, but studying nature in general. That angered a lot of people. And then what really got people angry was in 2020, I had an article in the Wall Street Journal with another biologist named Emma Hilton. It was titled "The Dangerous Denial of Sex," where we basically made the point. We defined what sexes were, why this is important, why trans people aren't the sex that they're claiming to be, and why this is important for society, for upholding women's rights, ensuring that children aren't transitioned based on a faulty premise of that sex is a spectrum or a social construct. Basically those are the arguments that we made. This resulted in a major backlash. I've got kicked off of PayPal and Etsy for writing about this topic. People went and contacted potential employers. My current employer, at the time I was working at Penn State as a biologist, and it was just this full court press trying to get me not just fired from my job, but to sort of salt the earth on my ability to even survive as an academic in the future. And I think
I love that you were canceled by Etsy, right? You couldn't even buy like a handmade pillowcase or anything because of your
yeah,
views.
yeah, and PayPal too. They were trying to come after my ability to get donations or anything
Right.
from people. So yeah, so that's kind of overall what happened.
I want to get to what's happening right now with Health and Human Services and the statement they just released about the definition of sex. But I also want to talk about the president's executive order. And I wanted to sort of, get your sense. Well, let's start with the HHS statement, since that most recently came out. It defined male and female as you just defined it. Why do you think it was important for HHS to make such a statement? And what will be the actual implications of it on the ground? What will I see when I go to the doctor's office, or when someone fills out that form when they take their child to the pediatrician? Tell me what the impact of the statement is going to be.
So it was very important to get definitions of male and female in law, especially at the federal level. For a long time, I think we had just gone along with the common sense notion that we all kind of know what males and females are in our everyday life. It was just assumed that when a law refers to men and women or males and females, that we all know what we're talking about, because by and large, we all do know what we're talking about, even if we don't know, if we've never heard the term gamete, for instance. We know it has something to do with reproduction. We know that there's two forms of this. It's pretty straightforward. It wasn't until in the last decade or more that we've had this concerted effort to really just undermine the fundamentals of what biological sex refers to. Trying to say it's, gametes are just one component of sex, but it's also many different things. It's this multivariate thing. It includes chromosomes and body shape and breast size and hip width and all the, voice pitch, facial hair, all this stuff. And these people are fundamentally confusing either upstream mechanisms of sex, like chromosomes, or like the downstream consequences of sex, which is like different hormones and different body shapes in general. That's not what sex is. And so we needed a definition. We needed to actually define what sex is, not just in humans, but these definitions in the HHS, these are universal definitions. They apply not just to humans, but to fish, to asparagus, to anything that reproduces by fusing two gametes of different sizes, sperm or ova. And we needed something that was going to be concrete, something that is permanent and universal, because if you just make these carve-outs for humans, then people are going to be able to try to poke holes in these things and bring up, we hear people bringing up clownfish all the time to try to suggest that humans maybe can change sex or certain things like that. So we needed something that we could point to, something that is as ironclad as possible and completely evergreen and timeless. Like this is what sexes are, this is what sex is. It was like that for the last 600 million years, and it's going to be like that until the sun takes over and engulfs the earth. So that's why we needed that.
Well, I just want to stop you and ask you to emphasize that point, because I think a lot of people, when they talk about sex, they think of it exactly as you just said. It should not be thought about as XX, XY. Can you just highlight for everyone again why the chromosomal definition is not the correct definition? You kind of said it before, but I think it's worth saying again.
This is a big point of confusion, both on both sides of the political spectrum, I think. A lot of people think that XX and XY, that's what makes an individual male or female. And in a way it is. We just have to be careful with the terms. So this results from a confusion with how sex is determined, and sex determination is a very specific term in developmental biology, and how sex is defined. Okay, so sex is determined in humans and mammals with sex chromosomes, but when we say it's determined, that just means what are the mechanisms that trigger an embryo to develop down a pathway that will lead to one of the other sexes. So there are certain species, like many reptiles, they don't have genetic sex determination or chromosomal sex determination. They have temperature-dependent sex determination. So the temperature at which the eggs are incubated is what decides the developmental pathway. So chromosomes don't define what sex you are. They determine it in a very developmental, technical sense. But we don't develop into a sex until about 6 to 8 weeks in utero. Okay, sex is a phenotype. It's an outcome of development. It is not a property of an embryo. We can look at chromosomes as a sex marker that is highly predictive of the sex that this individual will eventually develop into. But chromosomes do not equate to sex. That's an important point, I think, to make.
Great. Okay, I wanted that to be really clear. So back to HHS and the definition. So it's obviously important medically. It's important politically. It's become important politically to have created such a statement. What do you think? Can you tell everybody what the actual implications of it are going to be in their life? How are they going to experience the before and after of HHS's statement on the definition of sex?
For the vast majority of people, there's going to be absolutely zero change whatsoever in your everyday life. And I'd say for the majority of people who identify as transgender, there's also not going to be really a vast change. I mean, all we're going to see is perhaps federal legal documents reflect their biological sex instead of the sex that they identify as. And I mean, I know plenty of people who identify as trans who that's already the case. They never bothered updating their legal documents or their driver's license, and it's something they just don't even think about. So I think people are making too big of a deal of this. I mean, there's some people that will talk about, they may feel dangerous if they're traveling in another country and it outs them on their passport or something like that. So there could be, some concerns around the edges, but it's all kind of about trade-offs here, because being able to have a fabricated sex on a birth certificate, on official documents, this is important. These are legally protected categories, and if they're going to be legally protected, they need to actually reflect, the underlying reality. So I think there's much more negative outcomes if we're just letting people put whatever they want on their birth certificates or their identifying documents, than if we, cater to the vast majority of people first, and then maybe make exceptions when it's potentially needed.
Is this a going forward situation, or retroactively now people who have driver's licenses that say male when they're female, or vice versa? Do they have to go back and change them now under the law?
So I think states get to still do what they want to regarding sort of in-state identification type things. Mm-hmm. But they do, I believe, need to maintain a separate record, at least at the federal level. At least they should be doing that. And I think Trump might make that more clear in the coming months or so. Because, we have at the federal level, if we're protecting a category that's called sex and there's males and females, there's a precedent for making sure that the states are maintaining consistent definitions across it. Because if any state can define sexes however they want to, or not define it at all, then it ceases to be a meaningful protected category. So the federal government has sort of this interest in making sure that the states are defining their sexes according to how the federal government is defining sexes. Again, if we're going to have sex being a protected category at the federal level, it has to reflect the underlying reality that the federal government's trying to get at here.
Right. So the executive order that Trump issued about trans women or men who identify as women being in female sports sort of had this definition of male or men and women in it. And so the HHS statement is just more. It's just a level of support for that new reality. It doesn't add any new, there's no new expression of that on the ground, such as would have been found in the EO. There's no new thing you're saying that's going to happen to the lives of people as the result of this that they would notice.
Well, I mean, if you're an athlete and you identify as the opposite sex, if you're biologically male and you're trying to compete in female sports, right. I mean, there will be some changes because you're not going to be allowed to compete in female sports anymore. You're going
that was in the EO, but the HHS statement is separate, correct? They're two different
that's separate.
documents.
That's just a pure definitional document about what sex is, and it also defines man, woman, boy, girl, and parent, I think, as well.
Yes, mother, father. Remember those words too. Yeah. I guess I want to ask you now, less as a biologist and a little unfairly, maybe almost as a philosopher, because I'm really interested in the language aspect of this. Right. I mean, this agenda began with the capture of language and the enforcement, in some cases, and the criminalization in some cases of language. And this HHS document in particular, because it doesn't have any sort of specific action attached to it, it's just about definitions. It struck me as sort of a response via language to the assault on the language. And I wonder if you think we've gone too far. It's been too much already, where people's minds automatically have adapted now to think words like gender identity. And are we going to be able to reverse the capture of language? And are people going to speak like biologists again, or with at least an understanding of basic human biology? and was that part of the intention of creating this and to reframe the way people think and speak about these issues?
So I think the intent was bringing at least a tether to reality back to these definitions. I don't think that people had really adapted to ideas of gender identity because I just think these are words that people say that they have no idea what they actually mean, and everyone has kind of their own idea of what it means, which in a social sense might not be an issue, but if we're actually putting these types of definitions in law, in legal documents, then they need to have specific definitions. But when you look at how legal documents are defining gender identity in law, it's usually just completely circular. It's gender identity is someone's gender-related identity. That's often literally the definition that you'll see in here. So it contains zero informational content, which just lets people completely make things up as they go along, which it's just not a viable option. It's nothing. If there's a protected category called gender identity, but anyone can identify as whatever they want and change minute to minute or second to second, it's just complete madness. There's nothing there. There's no tether to reality. So yeah, these definitions are definitely trying to say, like, no, words need to have meaning. If we have a protected category, it needs to actually touch the real world in a meaningful way. And we have males and females, we have these protected categories because males and females do differ materially in very real ways. We're a sexually dimorphic species. And so we need to actually root these definitions, these protected categories, in actual biology, not just in the way people identify as things. So yeah, we do need to bring back, at least in this context, science needs to come back into the room, and we need to be very specific about what males and females are. And it's really not that complex of a thing, but it's been under assault for a long time, and so a lot of people are still confused about it today.
Tell us about your community, your colleagues in your field. Have they been receptive to this HHS statement, the definition being restored to what it had been? Is there a lot of pushback? What are you seeing?
It depends who you ask. I would say if you were to take a anonymous poll of all biologists, I think the overwhelming majority would agree with it, would think it's legitimate and good, and it's science-based. I know a lot of people, my former colleagues, people who are still in the academy, they reach out to me and they say that this is a fantastic definition. We're so glad that this is happening. But then we've just had 3 articles come out in Scientific American just this week, another one in Science News, that are really just trying to undercut this definition by promoting what I just think is complete sex pseudoscience. So we literally had one of these people in these magazines arguing that because males and females differ in height is not absolute, that not all males are taller than all females, therefore sex can't possibly be binary. And it's just like no one actually, no one is ever saying that. We say that sex itself is different than the sexes generally. Males and females' bodies differ in many ways that can be bimodal or sort of on a spectrum. We're on a spectrum of height, for instance. But just because there are downstream sex differences doesn't mean that we're all binary in every single way you can measure people. It's just, really, it only applies to the type of gamete you have the biological function to produce. So they are just flailing. They're trying to misrepresent the things that are in the HHS definition. Many of these things, like the HHS document, preempts a lot of these arguments that they're making in these articles, and they just chose to ignore the fact that the rebuttal is already contained within the document itself.
Right. And so how do you diagnose their need to persist in that narrative? What is that? Is it capture of the journals by political interests? Is it, the ideology has just been taught for a generation now, and so they've adapted it? Is it a moneymaker? What is it?
I mean, all of the above. The capture is definitely there for sure. Like Scientific American, the former editor-in-chief was all about, these sparrows with 4 sexes, even though they don't have 4 sexes, there's only 2, promoted so much of this type of sex pseudoscience. And any time that we would send articles in there, it's just immediately rejected without even review. And the same with many journals on this issue as well. Like, I can't get these articles rebutting this stuff published in any of those same sort of left-leaning newspapers or journals, just because they don't want to hear it. They've sort of equated the belief in the sex spectrum as kind of being synonymous with being a good, caring person. And if they start saying, actually sex is binary, suddenly they're parroting far-right talking points or something. At least they've convinced people to do. I mean, they see what happens maybe to people like me too, who did speak about this early and who were just slammed, and they go after their careers. If you're making any of the noises that I'm making, even slightly, you immediately get lambasted by your colleagues. You get put into this other category. The politics has really just made it such a volatile issue that most people, even if they secretly in their minds know that sex is not a spectrum, it's not a social construct, a lot of people just won't say it because it's such a headache. It's not really going to further their career. They just much rather get grants and work on their research rather than the headache that can ensue if you just start being forward about this type of stuff.
Right. So what would help to remedy some of that? Would it mean going from EOs and statements to legislation? And is that even possible?
So I don't think legislation really helps turn down the heat. I mean, it may turn it up because people now say like we're under attack at the federal level and the legal documents. Now that's not really a reason to not pursue policy, and because we do need policy that reflects reality. This actually will help everyone, or the vast majority of people, even if people throw fits about it. I just think it's a long project. It's kind of a cultural thing. People need to be exposed to different ideas. So I mean, even still today, I can't get stuff published in New York Times or Washington Post or any left-leaning organization. They won't have me on MSNBC to talk about this stuff. And so it's just been this built-in echo chamber, I think, on at least one side of this political spectrum on this issue. And it's gotten better just because more and more people have been speaking up from the center and the center left. It's much better than it used to be. It's still not fantastic, but it's just going to be more of the same. People need to be exposed to more of these articles, realize that people like me, I'm not some far-right MAGA white nationalist, anything. I'm just like a normal human being. I used to always vote Democrat up until recently. I'm pro-gay marriage, and universal healthcare sounds pretty good to me and all that stuff. So there's really nothing to be afraid of. I'm just trying to talk about biology, and this is what we should all be engaged with. We should be trying to have a conversation about what's true, and from a good faith perspective, from a place of trying to actually understand reality and grow and extend charity to other people when they disagree.
Sounds reasonable to me. If I went into the average K through 12 school in America, public school, what percentage of them are teaching biology? Your kind of traditional gamete-based biology, and what percentage roughly do you think are pushing that other narrative?
Yeah, I'm not sure the exact numbers. I couldn't give you a percentage. I do have so many teachers sending me stuff from what their schools are up to and promoting things like the gender-bred person that has the whole sex spectrum thing, and says that sex is this spectrum that's rooted in things like voice pitch and body hair and all this, these secondary sex characteristics. It's widespread, but I don't know how many teachers are actually teaching the sex spectrum. I think probably mostly they just don't talk about it either way. And I do know some people who say that they are afraid to talk about sort of the gamete-based definition because that can trigger you for an HR meeting because someone complained and said that it made them feel unsafe or things like that. That's what happened when I was at Penn State. I wrote the article for the Wall Street Journal just talking about gametes, and then suddenly I got emails saying that students on campus felt unsafe knowing that I was on campus, like I'm going to assault them.
The scary gamete guy. I think you're now the gamete guy. Yeah. Can I ask you, what do you think a win looks like? When does Colin Wright feel like this battle has been won, or that sanity has been restored? And can you tell me what sanity looks like in that world? What is sanity to Colin Wright?
I don't think we like to have this idea that like there's just gonna be a huge victory and then we all just pack up and go away and never have to address this again. In a way, like there are some big moments, like when Trump did sign the executive order defining biology in terms of biology, and that's a big win. That's like a moment we can celebrate that sanity has been restored. But I mean, sex has always been what that is. Like an EO doesn't define reality. Reality is already there, and because Trump did it, this is probably even polarizing more people on the left to reject this idea. So it was a win in one sense, but it's also just emboldened a lot of people who want to spread the sort of sex pseudoscience of the sex spectrum or social construct. So in a way, that was a big victory, but in also a way that was just the start of a whole new thing. Like the battle's kind of been both won and just started at the same time. So it's hard to know what an actual real victory would look like, because I don't think this ideology is never going to be like totally defeated. It's always going to be there. It's too prevalent right now. It just needs to have increased sanity sort of at the federal level, at the state level, and laws where we're not allowing males to compete in female sports. We're not using faulty sex pseudoscience as a justification for giving children these body and life-altering and sterilizing drugs that are very harmful to them based on no good evidence, but on this false premise that you can literally change your sex because sex is a multi-factorial thing. Then you can all modify your traits and you can move yourself along the sex spectrum. Like that's just scientifically not true. So we shouldn't be using that as a basis for transitioning kids. We shouldn't have, males in female prisons, that type of thing. So if we can get the policy wins, that's a victory, even though, there's always going to be opposition to this. It's going to be there. It's just whether or not it's so substantial that they're actually winning. Because before they had been winning, now I think we're seeing some sanity be restored, and I just hope we can maintain at least the sanity at the level of the laws.
Well, thank you for participating in the fight for sanity, and thank you for being with us today and explaining this. And where can everyone find more about you?
So you can follow my work on Twitter or X. My handle is @SwipeRight. It's WRIGHT. I also have a Substack called Reality's Last Stand, and it's just realitieslaststand.com. I publish a lot of my own articles on there and articles from other people. It actually started off as a place where I was tired of making the same arguments about, addressing chromosomes and hormones and all this stuff. So I just started writing articles. So whenever I saw people on Twitter at the time, I could just post a link. Here's an article about it. And then it just sort of blew up into its own magazine now. So it's a lot of fun. So go over there. You can find all my articles about the sex and why it's not a spectrum and why it's binary there. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
Great. Thank you so much for being here. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.